Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe. My guest is Jennie Jack, a member of the Tlingit Nation in northern British Columbia and the Yukon, who also spent 10 weeks behind the Mohawk barricades in Oka, Quebec in the summer of 1990. Welcome to Pressure Point, Jennie.
Thank you.
Jennie, you're from BC. You spent 10 weeks behind the Mohawk barricades at Oka. How did you get there and when did you go?
Well, I went on July 25th. The Mohawk Nation had sent out faxes requesting support from any Aboriginal groups who wanted to send people or give political support or financial support, and the Tlingit Nation decided to send 2 people down. And personally, the reason that I decided that I wanted to go down was I realized that it didn't matter whether it was in Quebec or anywhere in this country, that if the government was willing to walk on Mohawk people, they'd be willing to do that here also.
Why were there arms there? Why did the Mohawks have so many arms?
Well, first of all, the media portrayed, and the army definitely portrayed, and the governments, that there were a lot of arms, and there really weren't that many arms. But up until July 11th happened, there was a great debate between the Mohawk people as to whether to have arms involved or not, and most of the people wanted it to be a peaceful barricade. But when July 11th happened, there were only a handful of warriors there, and the municipality called in the SWAT team, and there was a 100-man SWAT team, which were from the SQ, who came in and fired 1,000 rounds at waist level. And the warriors were told only to warn them off, and they fired 100 rounds into the air. And the SWAT team had no intention of doing anything other than massacring the women and children that were there doing the tobacco ceremony, because it was very obvious because they were firing at waist level.
So in other words, it was in response to the actions of the SQ that led to the sort of heightened conflict.
Well, yes, it was, because the warriors never, throughout the whole thing, did they do anything but act in a defensive position. They never were aggressive.
Certainly, the role of the SQ is one that concerned a great many Canadians who watched the events of the summer. There were horror stories about how people were being treated by the police, certainly, and we saw that the Chateauguay incident when women and children were leaving Kahnawake and were being stoned and the police stood by and did nothing, as well as just a general concern about what was really going on. What were some of the stories that you heard or saw?
Well, the men were being tortured. One of the men in particular, one of the warriors, was arrested by the SQ, and he had cigarette burns all over his body. In fact, when he went in for his bail hearing, the Crown was arguing as to why he should not get his bail. And his lawyer had him unbutton his shirt and show it to the judge, and the judge just granted him bail right away. There were other incidents. A person that was in the treatment center, her son was severely beaten, and they took their boots off and used their runners so they wouldn't leave marks, and they beat him up very severely.
How about the role of the Army? In contrast to the SQ, when the Army were called in, what was the reaction among Native people at Oka?
Well, I remember trying to be very optimistic, saying the Army's going to treat us better than the SQ did. And the Mohawk people kept saying, no, they're not going to. And I kept trying to be optimistic about it because the Army was saying that they were not going to make any advances. They were going to come in and stay at the barricades right where the SQ were. We all know that didn't happen. They moved in the very first day and kept moving in right until they had us blocked right into the treatment center. They also said that they were coming in a peacekeeping role. And what they were going to do was act as a buffer between the Mohawks and the SQ. That didn't happen also, because as soon as the cameras were off and they were not acting as dignified as the media portrayed them to be. The media, the way that it came across through the media was that they were acting very dignified and they were just upholding law and order in this country. And yet as soon as the cameras were off, they were trying to provoke the Mohawks into shooting the first shot, because when they first came in, the Army very clearly said that they would not fire the first shot, but if they were fired upon, they would have to act accordingly. So as soon as the cameras were off, the Army used every bit of psychological warfare that they could to try to provoke the Mohawks into firing the first shot, and the Mohawks wouldn't. They did various things. For example, at one point, 5 soldiers came across the lines and severely beat up one of the Mohawk warriors, and they were trying to take him back across the lines when one of the other warriors came and stopped them from doing that. And the list just goes on and on of all the things they tried to do to make the Mohawks fire the first shot.
You refer to it as psychological warfare. Certainly from this distance, even it really felt like a war of nerves. What was the morale among the Native community at Oka?
Well, I can only talk about what was going on in the treatment center because that's where I was. Actually, it was the humor that Indian people are quite well known for that really kept us going a lot of the time. They tried everything to intimidate us, to make us give up and walk out, to make us fire the first shot. And yet, there were so many times that the Army almost came in, and we knew that it meant if they were coming in, they would come in firing, and we would be all dead. But it had happened so many times. There were so many times that they had said, come out by 6 o'clock or we're coming in. There were so many times we went to bed at night and we didn't know if we were getting up in the morning because most of their psychological warfare went on at night. So we didn't know from one day to the next, or sometimes from 1 hour to the next, whether they were coming in or not. After a while, it's almost like as if you got hardened to it. And at one point, they had said they were coming in at 6 o'clock, and we were eating dinner. It was like, okay, if you're going to come in, but we're not going to disrupt our lives and get ourselves all upset and panic again for nothing. So after a while, it's almost like we became very hard-nosed about it, and we just went about our daily business.
So in other words, you just learned to live with that kind of tension.
You learn to live with that kind of tension, plus it's the humor. I think we know that they were listening to what we were saying in there. We know that somehow it was all bugged, what we were saying in there. And it probably drove them crazy when we were supposed to be intimidated, and yet we weren't. Because at times when they were supposed to be coming in, we'd sit down and we'd eat dinner. And the men would be on the lines in their posts, but some of them were inside, and the women and children were inside, and we'd be talking and laughing, and life would carry on. And I think it must have drove them crazy because we were supposed to be cringing and being intimidated.
The situation at Oka and Ganawagi this past summer received an awful lot of media attention in Canada and around the world. Some people have called the Mohawk warriors terrorists, others have called them freedom fighters. What is your perception about the treatment that you received by the media? Was it fair or was it not?
Well, the reality is that if the media wasn't there, the story would not have gotten out. And if the story didn't get out, there would have been justification for the government to allow the Army to come in and just massacre those people, because that's what they wanted to do. So if the story didn't get out by the media to the Canadian people and to the world, it would have given them the okay to walk in because nobody was watching. But the whole story didn't get out. The media is definitely controlled by the government. That's very obvious. When about a week after the Army moved in on their final push, there were media inside, and CBC was pulled. CBC was pulled for no reason at all of them. National TV, local TV, radio, they were all pulled.
And I understand the American media did not cover this event
There
in
was
any major way.
No, there was hardly any media at all there from the States. We had more foreign press there than anybody else. There were people there from France and from all around the world. In fact, there were even people there from South America that were in the treatment center after the final push of the Army.
And of course, the Mohawk Nation straddles the two borders, doesn't
Yes.
the one border and the two nations. the United States and Canada. Can you say a little bit about the history of the Mohawk Nation and people?
Well, the Mohawk people have always said that they have sovereignty over their own territory and that they are a nation on their own. And they have gone to the UN for years to get that recognition. They have their own constitution, and in fact that constitution was adopted partially by the United States, and the whole notion of consensus, which the Iroquois people use, is used by the United States governments. And their whole philosophy of the Great Tree of Peace and the Truro Wampums have always been in place, and they have always followed it. And as a result of that, they have never ever claimed to be anything other than a sovereign nation.
And of course the dispute arose over land.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I know, land is very vital to Native self-understanding. Can you just elaborate a little on that? And the land claim settlements, which of course are pending right across the country.
Well, for Aboriginal people, well, for Tlingit people, I know that we don't have a concept of ownership of the land. Our concept is that we are put here to protect the land, to use the land, and to pass it on for generations to come. And that's the way that the Mohawk people operate. When they do anything, they have to think about 7 generations ahead. So they have to make sure that the land is going to be there for people 7 generations from now. And land is a very, very vital element within Indian philosophy. I know for myself, a lot of people don't understand how an educated person could feel that they need the land in order to survive. Because I don't need to go out and trap to live. But if I don't have the land to be able to go home to, I would die. It's a part of who I am, and it's a part of who the Indian nation is. And it's very hard to explain, but if I couldn't go home and be on the land and work with the land and be a part of the land, I could not continue surviving as a person.
And of course we'd all be wise to think 7 generations ahead, certainly given the state of the environment and the earth today. One of the things that was said was that once the barricades came down and so on, there would be negotiations and, more discussions. Just put away the arms and we'll have some negotiations. What's happened since?
Well, I've only talked to people in the Mohawk Nation a couple times in the Iroquois Confederacy since I've been back. Been very busy doing other things. And there have been no discussions. In fact, I talked to one of the Native leaders from BC. He was out in Ottawa the night that we walked out of the treatment center on September 26th. And he had heard, and as the Mohawk Nation had heard, that there was going to be a new land claims policy that comes out to deal with some of the issues that went on this summer. And they were off in Ottawa the night that we walked out, and they were meeting with Tom Siddon. And they said, "What about this new policy?" And he went, "I don't know about a new policy." And it was really hard for them to understand how they could say, on the one hand, there's a new federal land claims policy to deal with all of these issues, and really there wasn't. It was just being said for the media. But then that wasn't too hard to fathom when you realize that the governments had no intention of negotiating with the Mohawk people anyway. That was very obvious from the way that they handled things, because the Mohawk people would put proposal after proposal on the table, and the federal and provincial governments would just outright reject them without even really taking them very seriously. They had no intention of negotiating a peaceful resolution because they were just looking for justification to walk in and massacre the people.
What are law firms doing now to prepare for some of the litigations that will arise due to land claims?
Due to land claims everywhere?
Yeah, in this country.
Well, in British Columbia, for example, there are several cases that are in court now. There's the Bella Bella case that's being heard right now, and there are lawyers that are representing them. There are the twin tracking cases coming up, the Mears Island case is coming up, the Gitsan case is finishing. All of those cases are now in courts, and the firms are just dealing with them as they come up.
And how about Native bands themselves?
Well, we all know that Van der Zalm has said that he's going to negotiate with the Nisga'a people. It's really hard not to believe that that's not an election ploy. Good timing. But there are a lot of Indian nations in the province that are prepared to go forward with their land claims and negotiate now.
You are a law student at UBC. You are president of the UBC Law Students Association. And I know that UBC has a Native law program. And one of the things I'm wondering is, it seems that the legal system that a faculty of law would teach and everyone would have to work toward is very technical, quite rigid. It seems to me that it would be very different than Native traditional law, many of the values from a Native culture. What has your experience been studying? Have you found there's a cross-cultural conflict, a cultural conflict? And then how does the school deal with that?
Well, there is a big conflict. I remember in first-year law not being able to study for 2 weeks when I sat down to summarize my studies for property law. And I highlighted, centered, underlined, bolded a sentence which said, the Crown owns all the land. The elders taught me much different, and I had a really hard time dealing with that concept. And so I had a hard time dealing with the whole law school concept of what they were trying to teach me. But the whole reason for going to law school in the first place was so that I could learn the system well enough to be able to work within the system to help my people. And the major clash that I ran into was this summer, because all of my life has been geared towards learning the system well enough to fight within it. And this summer the system had absolutely no intention of dealing with any justice for the Aboriginal people, because the government refused to negotiate. They did everything they could to justify walking in and massacring the people by calling the negotiations that the Mohawk people tried to do bizarre, by discrediting what the Mohawk people were doing by saying that the warriors were terrorists, by saying that the Mohawk people were divided, by saying that the Mohawks were fighting over cigarettes and gambling, when that was not the case at all. The Mohawks were fighting over land, and they were fighting over who had jurisdiction over that land. And all of the wars that the Mohawks have ever gone to have been over those issues. And what the media has done is tried to portray that as fighting over cigarettes and gambling, which is a previous war which they fought in Akwesasne. And they weren't fighting over that. They were fighting over who had jurisdiction to tax the cigarettes, who had jurisdiction to regulate gambling on the reserve. And it's the same thing in Gunnesadage. They wanted to have the land, and they wanted to have jurisdiction over their land. And the municipality was trying to take it to make a golf course. And the governments were trying to discredit what the Mohawk people were doing. They had no intention of negotiating with those people, with the Mohawk people. And so what I saw was a system that was absolutely unwilling to deal with Indian people. And if they're going to do that in Quebec, they could do that anywhere else in Canada. And I also look at the system and what's happening with the Northwest Territories and the Dene people. They're being asked to extinguish their rights in order to settle their land claims. And yet the Sparrow case in the Supreme Court of Canada just recently said that Aboriginal rights exist in this country. So how can you on one hand have the courts saying that Aboriginal rights exist, and on the other hand the federal government is requiring Aboriginal people to sign away their rights? And then the Jaron case talks about how the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility to look after the Indians' best interests. And how can they be doing that when they're asking them to sign away their Aboriginal rights? And all of that is part of the system. All of that is part of the system that's supposed to be holding Aboriginal interests at heart. And they're supposed to be doing that in a trust-like situation. And that system is not dealing with Aboriginal people fairly. So what's the point of somebody like me wanting to learn the system, wanting to be a lawyer, wanting eventually to maybe be a member of Parliament of this country, all of that hoping to work for the Aboriginal people? Why do that if the system's not willing to work for you?
Does the Native Law Program try to advocate for any particular kinds of change, or are there other people in the system who recognize the discrepancy?
Okay, the Native Law Program is basically a program that just gets Aboriginal students into school. Once you're in there, you take all the courses the same as everybody else, and that's all the Native Law Program does. But what is happening in the law school, which I'm really, really proud of, is that they now have in most first-year property law classes Aboriginal title issues. And I feel really adamant that no matter what side you're going to be on when you get out of law school as a lawyer, whether you're going to be arguing for Aboriginal rights or against it, you've got to know and understand what Aboriginal title means. And the only way to do that is put it in a first-year course that's going to be mandatory for all students to take. There's several lectures that go on now on Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title at the law school. In fact, all the first-year property law students will be listening to a lecture fairly soon, and they will have Aboriginal people, Aboriginal lawyers, and profs coming in and talking about those issues. So it's starting. People are becoming more and more aware of it. The legal writing classes, some of the moot courts, which are mock courts that we have to do in first and second year, some of those issues are Aboriginal rights issues.
Certainly there has been a long history of injustice toward Aboriginal people in Canada, and one of the most unjust is the story of residential schools. You yourself went to a residential school. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, to me, residential schools are a big part of the reason why Aboriginal people are where we are today. Just before that, it was the Indian Act that made the people dependent on the system, because what it did is it set up rules and regulations that Indian people had to live by. For example, up until 1960, Indians couldn't vote. They couldn't go to school, they couldn't join the army, they couldn't go to university, they couldn't own a business, they couldn't drink, they couldn't do any of those things. And then the residential schools came along, took the children out of the homes and took them off to school. And it made them dependent on the system. And that's what both the Indian Act and the residential schools did for the people. And as a result, the parents that were left at home felt totally powerless, because all their children were being taken away from them. They had no control over them, no control over whether they could keep them at home or they had to go away. So some of them ended up turning to alcoholism. Then you would have the children that were in the schools who were beaten if they spoke their language or tried to practice their culture. We all know about the sexual abuse that was going on in those schools, and the abuse in general. Verbal abuse, being told that they were trying to tame the savage out of you and make you more civilized. And in the end, what the parents had coming home were children that were ashamed to be Indian, who didn't want to learn their language, didn't want to learn the culture, and didn't even, in fact, want to be part of the family anymore. You also had children who didn't know how to do had no parenting skills or any of those kinds of family skills that you need in order to function as a family, and didn't know how to do anything but be dependent on the system. And the Indian Act system is basically set up so that, same as a welfare system. And we all know that welfare is not put in place to move you ahead. It's put in place just to keep you still. And as a result, Aboriginal people became very dependent on the system.
Would you describe Canada as having a history of institutionalized racism?
Oh, definitely. South Africa had to come here to learn from looking at the reserve system on how to set up their townships in South Africa. They got the idea from how the reserve system was set up here.
Did the events of the summer give Canadians a very harsh look at our own racism?
I hope so. I hope that people realize that racism is always here, because those of us that get up every morning with brown faces know that it's here all the time. And I hope that people are going to address it.
Okay, and in that light, in March 1990 at UBC, the engineers published a newsletter which was appalling. It was blatantly discriminatory and racist toward Native people. It was also sexist and homophobic, but it particularly singled out Aboriginal people. You are now on the President's Advisory Committee for Race Relations at UBC. Can you say a little bit about that? Is that a step in a positive direction? And how do we affect that kind of institutional change or the attitudinal change?
Well, what the Race Relations Committee is trying to do now is they're inviting presentations from people all around campus to come in and talk about incidents of racism, but also to talk about how that can change. And I know that some of the ideas that a committee of people formed last year as a result of the engineers' newsletter, some of the things that they wanted to see were mandatory courses in first-year courses, like English 100, courses that everybody has to take, courses dealing with tolerance, racism, sexism, and homophobia, so that people have to look at it and have to address it somehow. And it's not going to be easy, because in law, in first year, there's a racism course going on right now, and it's very painful. A lot of people in this country do not want to admit that they're racist, and basically every single one of us is, and we all have to address it. And it's very hard to do when you've grown up in a family that allows that, and you don't know any different. It's very hard to address that.
Well, we all like to think of ourselves as nice, kind people, and it's difficult to look at the uglier, more evil sides of ourselves.
Well, especially in this country that likes to think of itself as the peacekeepers of this world, and yet they're willing to murder Mohawk people.
What about the future? What do you see happening in the next few years in terms of land claims?
Well, we've got Van der Zalm saying that he's willing to negotiate land claims in British Columbia. Let's hope he means it. Let's hope that it's not going to die as soon as the elections happen. We've got the federal government saying that they want to negotiate land claims in British Columbia and across the country, who have said that they're willing to talk to the Mohawks. Let's hope, too, that they also mean it, and that they're not going to change their mind as soon as the world's attention is taken off of them. There are very serious negotiations that need to go on as far as land claims go in this country, because if the government hasn't learned anything, they've got to know that as soon as they try to oppress Indian people more, the same as the 1969 white paper, which called for assimilation for Indian people within the country and called for wiping out any reference to Aboriginal issues in the Constitution. As soon as that happened, Indian organizations across the country sprang up to deal with that. And the same thing is happening now with the Oka incident this summer. Aboriginal people are coming together and banding together, and they're going to fight even harder.
Jennie Jack, thank you for being with me this evening, and thank you for being with us on Pressure Point.